the Morrison twins. The cool night air hung thick over the green hills of southern Ohio. In the small town of Milfield, nestled between old oak trees and winding streams, something terrible was about to happen. The year was 1868. America was still healing from a bloody war that had torn families apart. But in this quiet corner of Ohio, a different kind of horror was coming. One that would haunt Milfield for many years. Welcome to the Ghastly Journal. I'm your host. Tonight we tell you about the Morrison twins. Two brothers who died at exactly 3:33 in the morning, even though they were 500 miles apart. Elijah and Ezekiel Morrison were born on a stormy April night in 1840. Their parents were Thomas and Eleanor Morrison. They owned a small but good farm just outside Milfield. The twins looked exactly the same. Both had black hair and bright blue eyes. Both had a strange birthmark on their right shoulder. It looked like a crescent moon. The old woman who helped deliver the babies was named Miss Holloway. When she saw those matching marks, she whispered a prayer. Later, she told the neighbors that twins with matching signs were touched by something beyond our world. The Morrison family worked hard and believed in God. Thomas had gotten the farm from his father. His father had received the land after fighting in the War of 1812. Eleanor came from a family of teachers. She brought books and learning to a house where hard work was respected. As the twins grew up, the people of Milfield noticed something amazing about them. When Elijah fell from an apple tree at age 7 and broke his arm, Ezekiel was inside the house. But he grabbed his own arm in pain at the exact same moment. When Ezekiel got sick with scarlet fever at 12, Elijah got the same fever. It went away when his brother got better. They share one soul in two bodies, Eleanor would say. She felt proud but also worried. The Lord works in mysterious ways. The bond between the twins fascinated people in Milfield. Some thought it was amazing. Others found it scary. It challenged what they thought they knew about God's plan. The local pastor, Reverend Whitaker, told the Morrisons that their son's connection was a gift from God. It showed how strong family bonds could be. When the twins turned 18, the Civil War started. Many young men from Ohio wanted to fight for the Union. Thomas had lost his own brother at the Battle of New Orleans years before. He begged his sons not to join the army together. "If the worst happens," he said one night at dinner, "I couldn't bear to lose you both at once." After talking it over at the family's oak table, the twins made an unusual choice. This decision would change their lives forever. Elijah would join the army. Ezekiel would stay home to help with the farm. It was the first time they had ever been apart. On the morning Elijah left, both brothers cried as they hugged on the train platform in Columbus. "It feels like I'm leaving half of myself behind," Elijah said. His voice was quiet under the noise of the steam engine. "Because you are," Ezekiel replied. "But I'll feel what you feel, brother. We'll never truly be apart." Elijah served well in the 76th Ohio Volunteer Infantry. He fought at Vicksburg and later in the Atlanta campaign. Even during the war, his connection with his twin stayed strong. Ezekiel would wake up in the middle of the night with his heart racing. Days later, he would get a letter describing a battle Elijah had fought at that exact time. When Elijah got a small wound at Kennesaw Mountain, Ezekiel felt pain in the same spot on his leg. This confused Dr. Perkins, the town doctor. "I've read about such things," Dr. Perkins told Thomas Morrison, "but I've never seen it myself. The human spirit has mysteries that science doesn't understand yet." When the war ended in 1865, Elijah came home. His body was fine, but he had changed in ways only his twin could understand. The brothers spent days walking around the family farm. They didn't talk much, but they understood each other. Ezekiel could feel the terrible things his brother had seen in the war. "The things I saw, Zeke," Elijah would sometimes say, "they follow me into my dreams." "I know," Ezekiel would answer. "I've seen them too." In the years after the war, the Morrison twins went back to farm life. Both found it hard to think about getting married and starting families. How could they explain their connection to wives? How could anyone else understand the bond they shared? Instead, they worked to make the family farm bigger. They bought new equipment that was changing farming across the country. By 1868, the Morrison farm was doing so well that Thomas thought about buying more land to the west. This would cost money. There were rumors about opportunities in the growing railroad business. After much talk, they planned another separation. This time, Ezekiel would travel to St. Louis. A cousin there had connections to railroad investors. Elijah would stay in Ohio. St. Louis is nearly 500 miles away, Eleanor worried as Ezekiel packed his bag. You've never been apart at such a distance. Distance is just physical, Mother, Ezekiel told her. Elijah and I have proven that our bond goes beyond such things. The trip was planned for early June. Ezekiel would take a train to Cincinnati. Then he would take a steamboat down the Ohio River. Eventually, he would reach the Mississippi and St. Louis. The whole journey would take almost a week. He planned to stay in St. Louis for at least a month while looking for investors. On the morning he left, something strange happened that worried the family. As Ezekiel put his trunk on the wagon that would take him to the train station, both twins suddenly bent over in pain. They grabbed their chests. "What is it?" Thomas asked. He was scared by their matching reaction. The brothers looked at each other. Confusion showed on their identical faces. "I don't know," Elijah said slowly. "A sharp pain, like a warning. Or a bad sign," Ezekiel added quietly. Eleanor's grandmother had been known in the county for seeing the future. Eleanor immediately wanted to delay the trip. "Some things shouldn't be ignored," she said firmly. But the plans were made. Letters were sent. Meetings were scheduled. After talking briefly, the twins agreed the pain was probably just worry about being separated. Ezekiel left as planned. He waved from the back of the wagon until he disappeared around a bend in the road. For the first week of separation, everything seemed fine. A telegram came from Cincinnati saying Ezekiel had arrived safely. Another came from Louisville. As he continued his journey, Elijah did his farm work. Sometimes he would pause as if listening for a distant voice. But he told his parents he could still feel his brother's presence. 10 days after Ezekiel left, a letter arrived from St. Louis. It described his successful arrival and first meetings with potential investors. The letter sounded hopeful. It mentioned how the city was growing and how excited people were about railroad expansion. Ezekiel had found a room at the Planter's House, one of the city's best hotels. He had already made promising contacts. "All is going better than I dared hope," he wrote. "I miss you all terribly, especially you, Elijah. It's strange to look in a mirror and half expect to see you instead of myself. But I feel you with me as always." Elijah read the letter out loud to his parents at dinner. Thomas patted his son's shoulder with approval. "Your brother has a good head for business," he said proudly. "This venture will secure the family's future for years to come." That night, however, Elijah woke suddenly at midnight. He was covered in sweat and shaking. Eleanor always noticed disturbances in her house. She found him sitting on the edge of his bed, staring at the wall. "What is it, son?" she asked. She lit a candle that made long shadows across the room. "Something's wrong with Zeke," Elijah whispered. "I can feel it. It's like a shadow has fallen over him." Eleanor sat beside her son and took his hand. "What kind of shadow?" "I don't know." Elijah shook his head. "It's not physical pain or sickness. It's darker, deeper, like he's being chased by something." Eleanor suggested they send a telegram to St. Louis in the morning. But Elijah said there was no immediate danger, just a disturbing feeling that something had changed. He went back to bed but slept badly. His dreams were full of winding hallways and hidden doors. The next morning brought no new insights. Farm work needed attention. 3 days passed with Elijah stopping his work from time to time. He would tilt his head as if listening to a distant conversation. When his worried parents asked, he would only say, "Zeke is troubled but not in danger. Not yet." On the 4th day after Elijah's midnight awakening, another letter came from St. Louis. The handwriting looked rushed instead of neat and careful. The ink was smudged in places. Ezekiel wrote about successful meetings and promising talks. But between the business news were strange comments that caught the family's attention. The most peculiar thing happened yesterday. One part read, I was returning to my hotel room when I passed a man on the stairs. He looked at me with such recognition, such intensity that I nearly stumbled. He called me by name. Not my first name, but Morrison. I'm certain we've never met. When I asked his name, he smiled in a way that chilled me and said, only an old friend of the family. I asked at the front desk, but no one matching his description is registered at the hotel. Further down the page, Ezekiel mentioned another incident. I've begun to notice unusual things in my room. Items moved from where I left them. The distinct feeling of being watched as I sleep. Last night, I woke to find my window open. I'm certain I closed it before going to bed. The hotel staff insist no one has entered my room. I tell myself it's just the confusion of being in an unfamiliar city, so far from home. From you, Elijah. The letter concluded with a sudden change of plans. I've secured the initial agreements we sought, enough to proceed with our expansion plans. There's no need for me to remain in St. Louis for the full month. I plan to begin my journey home within the week. Some of the investors have suggested I investigate opportunities in Chicago before returning, but my heart pulls me homeward. There is something in this city that disturbs my peace in ways I cannot explain. Thomas read the letter with a worried expression. Perhaps the pressure of the negotiations is taking a toll on him. No, Elijah said firmly. There's someone watching him, following him. I felt their presence too, like a cold draft at the edge of my awareness. Eleanor crossed herself. This was a habit from her Irish grandmother that only came out in moments of deep worry. Do you think he's in danger, Elijah? Should we wire him to come home immediately? Elijah closed his eyes. He seemed to search within himself for the answer. Not immediate danger, he finally said. But yes, he should come home. Something isn't right in St. Louis. Thomas immediately went to the telegraph office in Milfield and sent a message to the planter's house. Conclude business. Stop. Return home immediately. Stop. Family concerns. Stop. The reply came the following day. Message received. Stop. Departing tomorrow. Stop. All well. Stop. The family felt relief, though Elijah remained troubled. He often paused in his work to stare westward, as if trying to see his brother across the hundreds of miles. 2 days later, as Thomas and Elijah repaired fencing in the north pasture, a rider approached from town. It was Jim Calloway, the telegraph operator's son. He was riding his horse unusually fast. Mr. Morrison, the boy called as he stopped his horse. Pa sent me with an urgent telegram for you. Thomas took the folded paper with hands that suddenly seemed unsteady. The message was brief. Delayed in Cairo. Stop. Strange occurrences continue. Stop. Man from hotel scene on steamboat. Stop. Will wire upon reaching Cincinnati. Stop. Cairo, Thomas murmured. That's in Illinois, where the Ohio meets the Mississippi. Something's wrong, Elijah said. His voice sounded hollow. Zeke is afraid. That night, Elijah couldn't sleep. He walked the floor of the bedroom the twins had shared since childhood. Sometimes he would stop to touch things belonging to his brother. A worn copy of Ivanhoe, a pocket watch their grandfather had given him, a sketch of the farm Ezekiel had drawn the previous autumn. Shortly after midnight, Elijah gasped and grabbed his chest. He fell to his knees beside the bed. Thomas and Eleanor rushed in to find their son pale and shaking. He's running, Elijah whispered. Zeke is running from someone or something. I can feel his heart racing as if it were my own. Where is he? Thomas demanded, already reaching for his coat. Is he still in Cairo? No. Elijah shook his head. He's on the river on a steamboat, but something's aboard with him. Something that knows us, knows our family. Eleanor helped Elijah to bed while Thomas paced the room. He was frustrated by their helplessness. There's nothing we can do until he reaches Cincinnati, he said grimly. From there, he can take the train directly home. He won't make it to Cincinnati, Elijah said. His voice suddenly sounded distant, as if he were speaking from the bottom of a well. The shadow I felt, it's darkening, growing stronger. No more telegrams came the next day or the day after. Thomas made repeated trips to the telegraph office. He sent messages to steamboat landings along the Ohio River, asking about a passenger named Ezekiel Morrison. No replies came. On the third night after the telegram from Cairo, Elijah woke screaming at 2 o'clock in the morning. His parents found him pressed against the headboard of his bed, eyes wide with terror. "He's coming," Elijah gasped. "Not by river or rail, but he's coming. Zeke is trying to reach home." "Thank the Lord," Thomas said, misunderstanding his son's distress. "But how? If not by steamboat or train?" "No, you don't understand." Elijah grabbed his father's arm with surprising strength. "He's being chased. The man from the hotel, the man who called him Morrison, is following him. Zeke abandoned the steamboat at Louisville. He's traveling overland, taking unusual routes, trying to throw off his pursuer." "But why?" Eleanor asked. Her voice was trembling. "Who is this man? What does he want with Ezekiel?" "It's not what he wants with Ezekiel," Elijah whispered. "It's what he wants with us. With the Morrisons." That same night, in a small roadside in nearly 200 miles southwest of Milfield, Ezekiel Morrison sat with his back against the door of his rented room. He held a letter knife in his trembling hand. He had fled the steamboat 2 days earlier after seeing the stranger from St. Louis standing on the upper deck, watching him with that same disturbing smile. Since then, he had traveled by hired wagon and on foot. He took winding routes northeast toward home. But somehow the man kept appearing. At a crossroads as twilight fell, in a general store where Ezekiel stopped for supplies, reflected in the window of a church as Ezekiel hurried past. Always watching, always smiling that knowing smile. Ezekiel had tried to send telegrams to his family, but the first 2 stations he found were closed. At the third, the operator told him the lines to Central Ohio were down due to recent storms. Now exhausted and increasingly paranoid, he could only hope that Elijah felt his distress and understood his desperate journey homeward. As he sat in that darkened room, Ezekiel's mind raced through broken memories and half-formed theories. The stranger had called him Morrison with such familiarity. What connection could this man have to his family? He tried to remember stories his father and grandfather had told about the family history. Disputes over land, business rivalries, incidents during the war. But nothing suggested an enemy with such persistent hatred. A floorboard creaked in the hallway outside his room. Ezekiel held his breath and tightened his grip on the letter knife. Footsteps approached, paused outside his door, then continued down the hall. He breathed out slowly, his hands shaking. "I need to reach Elijah," he whispered to himself. "Together, we might understand what this means." Back in Milfield, the Morrison family had reached a breaking point of worry. Thomas had written to Columbus to speak with railroad officials and place advertisements in newspapers along the Ohio River, seeking information about his missing son. Eleanor had taken the unusual step of consulting Mrs. Holloway, the elderly midwife who had delivered the twins. She now lived in retirement at her daughter's home on the edge of town. "The bond between twins is sacred and mysterious," the old woman told Eleanor. Her cloudy eyes stared into the distance. "If Elijah says his brother lives and journeys homeward, then it is so. But beware, such bonds can be used by those who understand their nature." "What do you mean?" Eleanor asked, leaning forward in her chair. Mrs. Holloway's gaze sharpened, focusing on Eleanor with surprising intensity. "There are those who study the hidden connections between souls. Your boys, with their matching moon marks and shared pains. They're rare, even among twins. Such connections hold power." "Power for what?" "That depends on who seeks to use it," the old woman replied mysteriously. While his mother sought wisdom from Mrs. Holloway, Elijah had taken to sleeping in the barn loft, away from his parents' worried eyes. There, surrounded by the familiar smells of hay and livestock, he would lie awake for hours. He focused all his mental energy on his connection to his twin, trying to send strength and guidance across the miles. In these quiet moments, Elijah began to receive clearer impressions. Flashes of vision, snippets of sound, brief physical sensations. He felt rain on his face when the sky above the farm was clear. He heard the creak of wagon wheels and the snort of unfamiliar horses. Once, most disturbingly, he tasted blood in his mouth and felt the sting of a split lip, though his own face had no injury. On the morning of June 17th, exactly 3 weeks after Ezekiel had left for St. Louis, Elijah burst into the kitchen where Eleanor was preparing breakfast. "He's close," he announced. His eyes were bright with certainty. "Zeke is less than a day's journey from home." "Praise God," Eleanor said, holding her son's hands. "How do you know?" "I dreamed of him last night, but it wasn't a dream. I could see through his eyes." He was looking at Miller's Creek. "He's coming through the western woods, avoiding the main roads." Thomas came in from his morning chores and caught the last of his son's words. "The western woods? Why wouldn't he take the road from Columbus?" "He's being followed," Elijah said grimly. "He's been followed since St. Louis." "By whom?" Thomas demanded. Elijah shook his head. "I don't know, but Zeke is terrified of him. There's something unnatural about this chase." Thomas Morrison was a practical man who had lived through war and hardship with calm strength. But the fear he saw in his son's eyes stirred something primitive within him, an ancient paternal instinct to protect his children at any cost. "I'll ride out to meet him," he decided, already reaching for his hat. "If he's coming through the western woods, I'll start at Miller's Creek and work my way toward Columbus." "No," Elijah said with unexpected firmness. "I should go. I can find him more easily than anyone else." After a brief argument, they decided that both would go. They would leave Eleanor at the farm with the hired hand, Jacob standing watch. They left within the hour, riding westward with rifles across their saddles. Thomas carried his out of practical caution. Elijah carried his out of a deeper, more visceral fear he couldn't fully explain. They searched until dusk, following game trails through the dense woodland. They called Ezekiel's name from time to time. As the sun began to set, Thomas suggested making camp and continuing at first light. But Elijah insisted they press on. "He's moving at night," Elijah explained, "hiding during daylight. He thinks it's safer." Thomas studied his son's face in the fading light. "You can feel this right now?" Elijah nodded, more clearly than ever. "It's as if, as the distance between us shrinks, our connection strengthens." They continued by moonlight. Thomas followed his son, who rode with unusual confidence through the darkened forest. Elijah would occasionally pause to close his eyes and tilt his head as if listening to an inaudible voice. Near midnight, as they approached a small clearing, Elijah suddenly stopped his horse. "He's here," he whispered. "Close." Before Thomas could respond, a figure burst from the underbrush 20 yards ahead. A man running at full speed, stumbling occasionally, but driving forward with desperate energy. Even in the dim moonlight, there was no mistaking Ezekiel Morrison. "Zeke!" Elijah cried, jumping from his horse. The running figure froze, then turned toward the voice. "Elijah!" The word was half sob, half prayer. The twins collided in an embrace that nearly sent them both to the ground. Thomas dismounted more slowly. His weathered face showed deep relief as he approached his sons. "Thank God," he said, placing a hand on Ezekiel's shoulder. "We've been sick with worry." In the moonlight, Thomas could see that his son was in terrible condition. Ezekiel's clothes were torn and muddy. His face was thin with exhaustion and fear. A half-healed cut marked his lower lip, and his hands were scratched and raw. "We need to go," Ezekiel said urgently. His eyes darted to the darkness behind him. "Now." "He's not far behind me." "Whose son?" Thomas asked. His hand moved instinctively to the rifle slung over his shoulder. "I don't know his name," Ezekiel's voice shook, "but he knows ours, knows about us." He clutched Elijah's arm. "About our connection." They helped Ezekiel onto Thomas's horse. Elijah shared his mount with his father. As they set off toward home, Ezekiel began to speak in hurried, sometimes unclear bursts. He told them of the strange man who had appeared first in St. Louis, then impossibly on the steamboat, then at every turn of his desperate journey homeward. "He doesn't travel like a normal man," Ezekiel said quietly, though there was no one to hear them in the darkened forest. "Sometimes I'd see him behind me, then take a turn thinking I'd lost him, only to find him ahead of me, waiting, as if he knew where I would go before I went there." "What does he want?" Thomas asked. His practical mind struggled to make sense of his son's story. "He spoke to me only once after I left the steamboat," Ezekiel replied. "I was getting water from a stream when he appeared on the opposite bank. He said, 'The Morrison twins are a rare specimen. Your connection defies natural law.' When I asked what he wanted from me, he smiled and said, 'Not from you, from both of you, the secret of your bond.' Then he just vanished. One moment there, the next gone, like a candle being blown out." Elijah and Thomas exchanged troubled glances over Ezekiel's head. "You think I've gone mad?" Ezekiel said flatly, catching their look. "No," Elijah replied immediately. "I felt him too, Zeke, like a cold presence at the edge of my mind." They rode in tense silence for nearly an hour. The horses picked their way carefully along the forest path in the deceptive moonlight. Thomas kept his rifle ready. His eyes scanned the shadows around them, though he wasn't entirely certain what he was looking for. When they finally emerged from the forest onto the familiar road leading to their farm, all three felt a moment of relief. The Morrison homestead was visible in the distance. Lamplight glowed warm and welcoming in the kitchen window where Eleanor undoubtedly kept watch. "We're nearly home," Thomas said, urging the tired horses forward. "Your mother will be overjoyed to see you safe, Ezekiel." But as they approached the final bend in the road, Ezekiel suddenly stiffened in his saddle. "No," he whispered. Horror filled his voice. "No, he's here." A figure stood in the middle of the road directly in their path. The moonlight showed a tall man in a dark coat. His face was shadowed by the brim of his hat. As they drew closer, he raised his head. The moonlight revealed a smile that sent ice through their veins. "The Morrison family reunited at last," the man said. His voice carried clearly through the night air, though he spoke barely above a whisper. "How touching!" Thomas raised his rifle. "Stand aside, stranger. You're trespassing on private land." The man's smile widened. "Am I? I believe the land has changed hands many times over the centuries. The Morrisons are but the most recent claimants." "Who are you?" Elijah demanded, instinctively moving closer to his twin. "A student of unusual phenomena," the man replied. "A collector of rarities. And you, Morrison twins, are perhaps the rarest specimens I've encountered in decades of study." Thomas cocked his rifle. "I won't ask again. Step aside." The stranger's gaze never left the twins. "Your bond is remarkable. I felt it from hundreds of miles away. A humming in the ether, like a tuning fork struck in a silent room. Two bodies, one consciousness flowing between them. Do you even understand what you possess?" "We possess nothing that concerns you," Ezekiel said, finding courage in his brother's nearness. "Oh, but you do." The man took a step forward, seemingly unconcerned by Thomas's weapon. "You possess a connection that defies the natural order. A connection that, if properly harvested, could unlock secrets most men cannot imagine." "Harvested," Elijah repeated, a chill running down his spine. The stranger extended his hands, palms up, in a gesture almost like begging. "I require only a small sacrifice, a demonstration of your bond's true potential." Thomas fired a warning shot into the air. "That's close enough." The man stopped, but his smile never faded. "Violence is unnecessary, Mr. Morrison. I'm offering your sons an opportunity to contribute to mankind's understanding of the spiritual connections between souls." "We're not interested," Thomas said firmly. "Now move aside, or the next shot won't go into the air." The stranger sighed as if disappointed by their lack of scientific curiosity. "Very well. If you won't participate willingly, there are other methods." What happened next occurred so quickly that later none of the Morrisons could agree on the exact sequence of events. The stranger seemed to flicker like a candle flame in a draft. Then he was no longer standing in the road before them, but somehow behind them. Thomas whirled, raising his rifle, but the man was impossibly fast, knocking the weapon aside. In the confusion, the horses reared in panic. Thomas was thrown to the ground, landing heavily on his side. Elijah jumped down to help his father while Ezekiel struggled to control his frightened mount. "You cannot outrun what's coming," the stranger said, now standing calmly several yards away, as if he had been there all along. "The wheels are already in motion. I've waited too long for specimens like you to leave empty-handed." Thomas rose painfully to his feet, retrieving his fallen rifle. "Get behind me, boys," he ordered. But when he turned to face the road again, the stranger had vanished. They stood in tense silence for several moments. The horses snorted nervously, ears flicking back and forth. "Is he gone?" Thomas finally asked, his rifle still raised. "I don't think he's ever truly gone," Ezekiel whispered. "He just withdraws, watches, waits." They completed their journey home in a state of high alert, jumping at every shadow and rustle of leaves. Eleanor met them at the door with tears of joy that quickly turned to concern as she took in Ezekiel's haggard appearance and the fear etched on all three faces. Once inside, with the doors locked and lanterns lit, Ezekiel told his mother everything that had happened since St. Louis. As he spoke, Elijah occasionally added details his twin hadn't mentioned, impressions he had received through their bond. This confirmed the reality of their connection and the bizarre nature of the events. "This man, whoever he is, knows things about us that no one outside this family could know," Ezekiel concluded. "About our birthmarks, about times we've felt each other's pain or illness." "He spoke of harvesting your connection," Thomas added grimly. "Whatever his intentions, they mean harm to my sons." Eleanor, who had listened in horrified silence, suddenly stood and went to a chest in the corner of the room. From it, she withdrew a small leather pouch that had belonged to her grandmother. "In the old country," she said quietly, "twins were considered blessed by special protection, but also vulnerable to those who would use their bond for dark purposes." She opened the pouch, revealing small bundles of dried herbs and 2 smooth stones marked with unfamiliar symbols. "My grandmother gave me these when you were born. I thought it superstitious nonsense at the time, but now—" Thomas, normally dismissive of such folk remedies, merely nodded. After what he had witnessed on the road, a man appearing and disappearing like smoke, he was beyond skepticism. Eleanor placed one of the marked stones in each twin's palm. "Keep these with you at all times," she instructed. "According to my grandmother, they disrupt attempts to manipulate the bond between twins." The family decided that none of them would be alone in the coming days. The twins would sleep in the main room of the house, with their parents taking turns keeping watch. Jacob, their hired hand, was sent to alert the sheriff about the stranger, though they had little hope that conventional law enforcement could address their unusual predicament. For 3 days, a tense calm prevailed. There was no sign of the mysterious stranger, and the twins began to hope that Eleanor's protective stones had worked. Ezekiel gradually recovered his strength, though both he and Elijah were plagued by restless sleep and unsettling dreams they couldn't quite remember upon waking. On the 4th night after Ezekiel's return, a summer storm rolled across Ohio. It brought heavy rain and spectacular lightning that lit up the countryside in stark flashes. The Morrison family gathered in the main room. Thomas read aloud from the Bible by lamplight. Eleanor mended clothing and the twins played chess, a game at which they had always been perfectly matched. Their contests typically ended in draws. As the storm reached its peak, a particularly violent thunderclap shook the house, causing the lamps to flicker. In that moment, both twins gasped and clutched their chests. The chess pieces scattered across the floor as they fell to their knees. "What is it?" Eleanor cried, rushing to their side. "He's here," the twins said in unison, their voices blending in a way that sent shivers down their parents' spines. Inside, Thomas seized his rifle from beside the door. "Stay together," he ordered, moving to check the windows and doors. All remained securely locked. A flash of lightning lit up the room. In that instant, all four Morrisons saw it. A shadow cast upon the wall that belonged to none of them. A tall, slender shadow with a brimmed hat, standing perfectly still in a corner where no person stood. When darkness returned a split second later, Eleanor began to pray, her voice trembling. Thomas fired at the corner. The shot was deafening in the confined space of the room. But when the next lightning flash came, the shadow remained unmoved and untouched. "You cannot shoot a shadow, Mr. Morrison," came a voice that seemed to come from the walls themselves. "Nor can you hide your sons from me." The twins stood shoulder to shoulder, each holding one of Eleanor's stones in a white-knuckled grip. "What do you want from us?" Elijah demanded. The disembodied voice chuckled. "I've told you. I wish to study your connection, to understand it, to extract its essence." "For what purpose?" Ezekiel asked. "Knowledge, power, immortality." The shadow on the wall seemed to grow larger with each word. "Twins like you appear perhaps once in a generation. Your connection exists in a realm between the physical and the spiritual, a bridge I have sought for decades." Thomas fired again, this time at a different corner where the voice seemed to come from, but to no effect. "Your protection is admirable but useless," the voice continued. "I have already begun the process. Even now, I am drawing upon the energy that flows between your sons. Can they not feel it? The subtle draining of their shared essence." The twins looked at each other, both realizing with horror that they had indeed felt increasingly weak over the past days. They had attributed it to stress and lack of sleep. "The stones," Elijah whispered to his brother. "Grandmother's stones." They clutched their protective talismans tighter. For a moment, the shadow on the wall seemed to waver like a reflection in disturbed water. "Interesting," the voice mused, "but insufficient. What was begun cannot be undone. By sunrise, it will be complete, and your unique bond will have served its purpose." "What purpose?" Thomas roared, reloading his rifle with shaking hands. But the voice did not answer. The shadow faded, even as lightning continued to flash outside, leaving the family in a state of dread and uncertainty. Eleanor clutched her son's hands. "We need to leave," she said urgently. "Get as far from here as possible." "We can't outrun him," Ezekiel said wearily. "He found me in St. Louis on the river, in every town and crossroads along my journey home. Distance means nothing to him." "Then what can we do?" Eleanor asked, tears streaming down her face. The twins looked at each other, communicating in that wordless way that had always been theirs alone. After a long moment, Elijah spoke. "We need to break the connection." "What?" Thomas and Eleanor exclaimed together. "Our bond is what he wants," Elijah continued. "If we can sever it somehow." "Is that even possible?" Thomas asked. "You've been connected since birth." "I don't know," Ezekiel admitted. "But I think we must try." The family spent the remainder of that stormy night consulting Eleanor's grandmother's folk remedies, the family Bible, and their own desperate imaginations. By dawn, they had formed a plan based more on instinct than knowledge, a last resort born of fear and love. As the first light of morning crept through the windows, Thomas saddled 2 horses. The plan was for the twins to separate, to ride in opposite directions as far and as fast as they could. They hoped that physical distance would strain their bond to the breaking point. Elijah would head east toward the Appalachian foothills. Ezekiel would go west toward the flat farmlands bordering Indiana. "If this shadow man is drawing power from your connection," Thomas reasoned, "perhaps stretching it thin will weaken him. Give us time to find a more permanent solution." The twins embraced their mother, who pressed fresh protective herbs into their pockets and hung small pouches around their necks. "Ride until noon," Thomas instructed. "Then find somewhere safe to rest, a church if possible. Write to us of your location. We'll send word when it's safe to return." The brothers mounted their horses. Each carried provisions for several days and what little money the family could spare. "I've never not felt you," Ezekiel said quietly to his twin. "I don't know who I am without our bond," Elijah replied. "But better to lose the bond than to have it stolen and misused." As the twins prepared to depart in opposite directions, a cold wind suddenly swept across the farmyard. It carried with it a voice now hauntingly familiar. "A valiant effort," it whispered in their ears. "But useless. The process is too far advanced. Distance will not save you now." The twins spurred their horses nonetheless. Elijah galloped eastward and Ezekiel westward. They rode away from each other for the first time in their lives with the deliberate intention of breaking their lifelong connection. Thomas and Eleanor watched until both riders disappeared from view, then returned to the house to pray and wait. The twins rode hard through the morning. Each felt the physical strain of the separation with every mile. By midday, both had developed pounding headaches and a sensation like hooks pulling at their insides, drawing them back toward each other. But they pressed on, following their father's instructions. Elijah reached the town of Zanesville by late afternoon, nearly 80 miles from home. Exhausted and feverish, he took a room at a small inn and collapsed onto the bed. His mind reached instinctively for the familiar presence of his twin. To his horror, what he felt was not Ezekiel's consciousness, but something else. A dark, probing presence that seemed to be using the twins' bond as a pathway. Elijah clutched Eleanor's stone tightly, focusing all his will on blocking this intrusion. Hundreds of miles to the west, Ezekiel had reached the outskirts of Indianapolis. He had ridden with barely a pause since morning. He too felt the alien presence attempting to break into their connection. He fought against it with desperate energy. Throughout the night, both twins battled this unseen force. Their bodies burned with fever as the spiritual struggle showed itself physically. By dawn, both were delirious, muttering incantations from Eleanor's folk traditions mixed with prayers and pleas to each other across the impossible distance. In Milfield, Thomas and Eleanor kept a careful watch, startling at every creak and shadow in the house. Shortly after midnight, all the candles and lamps in the house suddenly went out by themselves, plunging the room into darkness. When Thomas managed to relight a lamp, they found words scratched into the wooden floor that hadn't been there moments before. "The separation accelerates the process. Thank you." Eleanor wept as the horrible truth dawned on them. They had done exactly what the entity wanted. They had stretched the twins' bond to its limit, making it more accessible to his mysterious harvesting process. Thomas immediately sent urgent telegrams to both Zanesville and Indianapolis, instructing the twins to return home immediately. But he received no reply from either location. For 3 days, the parents waited in an agony of uncertainty. Then, on the morning of the 4th day, a telegram arrived from Zanesville. "Elijah gravely ill. Stop. Doctor baffled. Stop. Come quickly. Stop." It was signed by the innkeeper where Elijah had taken a room. Thomas left immediately for Zanesville, instructing Eleanor to remain at the farm in case Ezekiel returned or sent word. When Thomas arrived at the inn in Zanesville the following day, he found his son burning with a fever that the local doctor could neither diagnose nor treat. Elijah drifted in and out of consciousness. Sometimes he spoke clearly, other times he babbled about shadows and bridges and twins. "Does he mention his brother?" Thomas asked the doctor anxiously. "Constantly," the physician replied. "He calls for someone named Ezekiel. Is that his twin?" The innkeeper mentioned they look identical. "Yes," Thomas said. "They've never been separated before. Not like this." The doctor shook his head. "I've read accounts of twins experiencing physical distress when separated, but nothing like this. It's as if his very life force is being drained away." During a moment of clarity, Elijah clutched his father's hand. "He's using our bond," he whispered, "like a bridge between worlds. I can feel him feeding on it, on us." "Your brother?" Thomas asked, confused. "No, the shadow man." Elijah's eyes rolled wildly. "He's strongest at night, at the darkest hour. 3 o'clock. That's when he draws the most from us." Thomas sent another flurry of telegrams to Indianapolis, desperate for news of Ezekiel. But he received no response. After 2 days at Elijah's bedside, Watching his son grow weaker by the hour, he made a painful decision. He would have to leave Elijah in the care of the Zanesville doctor and travel to Indianapolis to find Ezekiel. Before departing, Thomas sat beside his son, who had fallen into a restless sleep. "I'll bring your brother home," he promised. "Whatever this shadow man is, we'll face him together." But as Thomas rose to leave, Elijah's eyes suddenly opened, clear and focused for the first time in days. "It's too late," he said with eerie calm. "Zeke knows. We both know. There's only one way to break the bridge." "What do you mean?" Thomas asked, dread filling his heart. "I love you, Father," Elijah said simply, then closed his eyes again. Thomas departed for Indianapolis with a sense of foreboding that grew with every mile westward. When he finally reached the city 3 days later, he discovered that Ezekiel had indeed taken a room at the hotel mentioned in their plans. But he had checked out the previous morning. He was in a terrible state, the hotel clerk recalled. Feverish, barely able to stand. I suggested calling a doctor, but he insisted he needed to return home immediately. "Did he say how he intended to travel?" Thomas pressed. The clerk shook his head. "He paid his bill and left. But sir, if I may say, he didn't look well enough to travel anywhere." Thomas spent a frantic day searching Indianapolis. He checked stables, train stations, and stagecoach offices. Finally, at a small livery on the eastern edge of the city, he found someone who remembered Ezekiel. "Strangest thing," the stableman said, scratching his beard. "Fellow who looked just like you described came in 2 days ago. Traded a fine horse for an old nag not worth half as much. Said he needed a horse that wouldn't be missed. When I asked where he was headed, he just said, 'To meet my brother.' Had the look of a man going to his own funeral, if you don't mind my saying." This news chilled Thomas to the bone. He immediately began the journey back toward Ohio, pushing his horse as hard as he dared. His mind was filled with terrible possibilities. He reached Zanesville in record time, only to find that Elijah had disappeared from his sick bed the previous night. The innkeeper reported that despite his weakness, Elijah had somehow managed to dress himself and leave unnoticed in the small hours of the morning. "The doctor says it's impossible," the innkeeper told Thomas. "The boy could barely lift his head the day before. Yet sometime after midnight, he simply walked out." Thomas, exhausted and desperate, could only think to return home. He hoped against hope that his sons had somehow made their way back to the farm. He rode through the night, arriving at the Morrison homestead just as dawn was breaking. Eleanor met him at the door, her face pale with lack of sleep. "No word," she said before he could ask. Nothing from either of them. For 3 days, Thomas and Eleanor waited in agonizing suspense. They sent inquiries to every town and settlement within 100 miles. On the morning of the 4th day, a rider appeared on the road. Sheriff Blackwood from Milfield, his expression grave as he dismounted in the Morrison yard. "Thomas," he said, removing his hat. "Eleanor, I'm afraid I have news." The sheriff had received telegrams from 2 different counties, one from the east, one from the west. Both reported the same grim finding. A young man matching the description of the Morrison twins, dead under mysterious circumstances. The eastern report came from a small church in the hills of western Pennsylvania, where the body had been discovered on the altar steps. The western report came from a crossroads chapel in eastern Illinois. "The strangest thing," Sheriff Blackwood said, his voice hushed with superstition, "is that both deaths apparently occurred at exactly the same time, 3:33 in the morning, despite being some 500 miles apart." Eleanor collapsed into Thomas's arms, overcome with grief. Thomas, struggling to maintain his composure, asked if there was any indication of how his sons had died. "That's another peculiarity," the sheriff admitted. "Neither body bears any mark of violence or evident cause of death. The doctor in Pennsylvania suggested it was as if the young man's life force had simply departed." In the days that followed, as arrangements were made to bring the bodies of Elijah and Ezekiel Morrison home for burial, strange reports circulated throughout the region. Travelers spoke of an unusually tall, slender man in a brimmed hat seen wandering the roads between Ohio and Pennsylvania, between Ohio and Illinois. His face bore an expression of confusion and rage. Some claimed to have heard him muttering about incomplete extraction and severed bridges. The Morrison twins were laid to rest in the Milfield cemetery, side by side as they had lived. The official cause of death was recorded as fever of unknown origin. But the people of Milfield whispered other explanations, of spiritual bonds and dark entities, of sacrifices made to protect the living. Thomas and Eleanor Morrison never spoke publicly of the Shadow Man or the terrible choice their sons had made. But in private family correspondence, discovered decades later by descendants, Eleanor wrote to her sister, "Our boys understood in the end what we did not, that their bond, their precious connection, had become a doorway for something that should not enter our world. They chose to close that door the only way they could. They chose to die at the same moment, breaking their connection through death rather than allowing it to be used for dark purposes. I believe with all my heart that they are together still, but in a place where shadows cannot reach them." The Morrison farm still stands today, though it passed out of family hands in the early 1900s. Local residents occasionally report seeing two identical young men walking the boundaries of the property in the pre-dawn hours. Always together, never apart. They disappear if approached, leaving behind only a lingering sense of protective watchfulness. Perhaps the most curious postscript to this tale came in 1904, when the church in Pennsylvania where Elijah died was being renovated. Workers removing the old altar found embedded in the wood beneath it a smooth stone marked with unusual symbols, identical to one discovered 30 years earlier during repairs to the Illinois chapel where Ezekiel breathed his last. The stones now reside in the Milfield Historical Society, along with a faded daguerreotype of the Morrison twins. Their solemn faces are so perfectly identical that even their parents sometimes confused them. Visitors to the display often remark on a peculiar sensation, a humming energy that seems to pass between the stones when they are placed side by side, a connection that, even after all these years, refuses to be completely severed. This has been the story of the Morrison twins, who died at 3:33 a.m., exactly 500 miles apart, for the Ghastly Journal. Sleep well, and remember, some bonds are stronger than death, and some are strong enough to challenge even the darkest forces.